Marcus River had always been an early riser, but that Tuesday morning in September felt different. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of changing leaves as he stepped onto his back deck, coffee mug in hand, ready to witness what had become his daily ritual for the past 3 years. The private lake behind his property stretched out like a mirror, reflecting the golden sunrise and the occasional ripple from a bass breaking the surface. What he saw instead made his coffee mug slip from his fingers, shattering against the wooden deck. The lake was gone. Where crystal-clear water had lapped gently against his dock just 12 hours earlier, now lay nothing but cracked mud, dying fish gasping in scattered puddles, and the skeletal remains of submerged logs that had been hidden for decades. The massive drainage pipe that fed into the county's storm system, a pipe that had been sealed shut since the lake's creation, gaped open like a wound, explaining the devastation before him. Marcus stumbled down the slope toward what used to be the water's edge, his mind racing. This wasn't natural. Lakes didn't just disappear overnight. Someone had deliberately opened that drainage valve, and he had a sinking suspicion about who was responsible. The Sunset Meadows Homeowners Association had made their position crystal clear over the past 18 months. What they called excessive fishing activities had become a bone of contention that grew more bitter with each monthly meeting. It started innocently enough. Marcus enjoyed early morning fishing sessions before work, sometimes joined by his teenage son Jake on weekends. The lake was technically within the community's common area, but Marcus's property line extended to the water's edge, giving him legal access that the HOA couldn't challenge. At least, that's what he thought. The trouble began when HOA President Victoria Blackwell moved into the neighborhood. A sharp-tongued woman in her early 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and an air of entitlement that preceded her into every room. Victoria had made it her mission to elevate the community's standards of Sunset Meadows. She viewed Marcus's fishing as an eyesore that detracted from the pristine aesthetic she envisioned for their upscale development. The property values are directly tied to maintaining our community's sophisticated image, she declared at the June HOA meeting, her manicured finger pointing directly at Marcus. Fishing equipment scattered about, the smell of bait, people tramping around the lake at all hours. It's simply not in keeping with the lifestyle our residents expect. Marcus had tried to reason with her. He kept his gear organized, never left trash behind, and followed all local fishing regulations. His morning sessions were quiet and respectful. But Victoria wasn't interested in compromise. She wanted him gone from her lake entirely. The situation escalated when Victoria discovered that Marcus had been teaching neighborhood kids how to fish during summer weekends. What he saw as community building, she viewed as a liability nightmare. She began documenting every fishing trip with photos, measuring the duration of his stays, and building what she called a case for enforcement action. Now standing in the toxic-smelling mud that had been his peaceful sanctuary, Marcus felt a rage building that surprised him with its intensity. This wasn't just about fishing anymore. This was about power, control, and a woman who believed she could destroy someone's happiness to prove a point. He pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of the environmental disaster spread before him. Dead fish, exposed trash, and the obvious evidence of human interference with the drainage system. Victoria Blackwell had just made the biggest mistake of her life, and Marcus Rivera was going to make sure she paid for every single consequence of her actions. By noon, Marcus's backyard had transformed into a crime scene of sorts. He'd spent the morning methodically documenting every inch of the devastated lake bed, but more importantly, he made some calls that would change everything. The first person to arrive was Detective Sarah Chen from the county's Environmental Crimes Unit, a compact woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She surveyed the scene with the methodical precision of someone who'd seen too many cases of environmental destruction disguised as property disputes. "Tell me about the drainage system," she said, pulling on latex gloves as she approached the exposed pipe. "Who has access to the controls?" Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead, the September sun now beating down mercilessly on the exposed lake bed. According to the original development plans, only the County Water Management Department and the HOA board should have keys to that valve housing. But I've been watching this lake for 3 years. That valve has never been touched. Detective Chen crouched beside the massive drainage pipe, examining the fresh tool marks on the valve wheel. These scratches are recent. Someone used a pipe wrench probably sometime between midnight and dawn. She stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. This wasn't a maintenance decision. Someone deliberately opened this valve with the specific intent to drain the lake. The second arrival was Dr. Janet Hoffman, a fish and wildlife biologist from the State Environmental Protection Agency. Her expression grew increasingly grim as she collected samples of the dead fish scattered across the muddy lake bed. "We're looking at a major ecological disaster," she told Marcus, carefully placing a deceased bass into a specimen container. These fish didn't just die from lack of water. They'd been poisoned by the sudden concentration of pollutants that were stirred up when the water level dropped rapidly. The legal ramifications for whoever did this are severe. Marcus felt a mixture of vindication and sorrow as he watched the professionals work. Each dead fish, each piece of evidence represented not just the destruction of his peaceful retreat, but a genuine environmental crime that could carry serious legal consequences. The third visitor surprised him. Rebecca Martinez, an investigative reporter from the local newspaper, arrived with a camera and a determined expression that reminded Marcus of a bloodhound on a scent. "I've been investigating HOA abuses for the past 2 years," she explained, setting up her camera to capture the scope of the damage. "Your story fits a pattern I've been tracking. Victoria Blackwell has a history of using extreme measures to get her way, but this time she may have gone too far." Rebecca pulled out a tablet and showed Marcus a series of articles she'd written about Sunset Meadows. 3 months ago, she had a neighbor's vegetable garden declared a health hazard and forced them to remove it. Last month, she convinced the city to tow a classic car that was parked in someone's driveway, claiming it was abandoned. The owner was out of town for 2 weeks visiting family. Marcus stared at the articles, his anger growing. "So this is just her latest power play?" "The difference is," Rebecca said, taking photos of the environmental damage. "Those other situations were civil matters. This is potentially criminal. Environmental destruction, endangering wildlife, possible trespassing to access the valve controls. She may have finally crossed a line she can't come back from." As the afternoon wore on, more evidence emerged. Detective Chen discovered fresh tire tracks near the valve housing, suggesting someone had driven a vehicle close to the drainage controls in the early morning hours. The county water management office confirmed they had no scheduled maintenance and all their keys were accounted for. Most damning of all is the discovery that Victoria Blackwell had been asking detailed questions about the lake's drainage system at the previous month's HOA meeting, questions that seemed innocent at the time, but now appeared to be reconnaissance for her plan. By evening, Marcus stood on his deck watching the investigators pack up their equipment. The empty lake bed stretched before him like a wound, but for the first time since that morning, he felt hope. Victoria Blackwell's reign of terror in Sunset Meadows was about to come to an end, and justice was finally within reach. The emergency HOA meeting was called for Thursday evening, just 2 days after the lake disaster. Victoria Blackwell had tried to frame it as a community discussion about water management issues, but word had spread quickly through Sunset Meadows about what had really happened. The community center was packed with residents who had never shown interest in HOA politics before. Marcus arrived early, armed with a folder full of evidence and Detective Chen's business card in his pocket. He'd spent the previous day consulting with an environmental attorney who'd taken one look at the photos and documentation and agreed to represent him pro bono. The case, the lawyer had said with barely contained excitement, was a slam dunk. Victoria entered the room with her usual air of authority, but Marcus noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she shuffled her papers. She was flanked by the other board members, most of whom looked uncomfortable and kept shooting nervous glances in Marcus's direction. "I'd like to address the unfortunate situation regarding our community lake," Victoria began, her voice steady despite the hostile energy in the room. "Due to necessary maintenance issues identified by the county, we had to temporarily drain the lake for safety inspections." Marcus stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "That's a lie, Victoria, and you know it." The room fell silent. Victoria's perfectly composed mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the panic underneath. "Mr. Rivera, you're out of order. This is an official HOA meeting with proper protocols." "Protocol?" Marcus's voice rose. "Is it protocol to commit environmental crimes? Is it protocol to destroy protected wetlands? Is it protocol to kill hundreds of fish just because you don't like seeing me enjoy my morning coffee by the water?" Board member Tom Harrison, a retired accountant who served on the HOA for 6 years, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Victoria, perhaps we should clarify exactly what happened with the drainage system. I wasn't aware of any county maintenance requests." Victoria's composure cracked further. "The decision was made by executive authority during an emergency situation. The board doesn't need to micromanage every operational detail." "Executive authority?" Marcus pulled out his phone and played a recording. "This is Detective Sarah Chen from the County Environmental Crimes Unit. She's very interested in your executive authority, Victoria, especially since the county has no record of requesting any maintenance, and especially since opening that valve without proper permits violates at least 6 state environmental protection laws." The room erupted in murmurs. Several residents began demanding explanations, while others pulled out their phones to record the confrontation. Victoria's face had gone pale, but she tried to maintain control. "This is clearly a personal vendetta," she said, her voice now noticeably shaking. "Mr. Rivera has been hostile to this board's authority from day one. He's trying to create a crisis where none exists." "No crisis." Marcus opened his folder and began pulling out photographs. "These are pictures of the dead fish in what used to be our lake. This is a report from Dr. Janet Hoffman, state wildlife biologist, confirming that this was an environmental disaster. And this, he held up a document with official letterhead, is a warrant for your arrest that will be served tomorrow morning. The room fell completely silent. Victoria stared at the document, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Rebecca Martinez, the investigative reporter, stood up from the back of the room. I've been documenting HOA abuses in this community for 2 years, and I can tell you that what Mrs. Blackwell did goes far beyond a property dispute. This is criminal destruction of natural resources, and the evidence is overwhelming. Tom Harrison looked at Victoria with a mixture of shock and disgust. Victoria, please tell me you didn't actually drain the lake just to stop Marcus from fishing. For a long moment, Victoria said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke words that would haunt her for years to come. I did what I had to do to protect this community's values. If people can't understand that, then they don't deserve to live in Sunset Meadows. The room exploded. Residents began shouting, demanding her resignation, calling for emergency board elections. Several people pulled out their phones to call the police, while others began discussing class action lawsuits for the environmental damage to their property values. Marcus watched the chaos unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Victoria Blackwell had finally revealed her true nature to everyone, but the cost had been devastating. The lake that had brought him so much peace was gone, possibly forever. Even if they could refill it, it would take years for the ecosystem to recover. As the meeting dissolved into chaos and Victoria fled the room, Marcus realized that winning this battle would come with its own heavy price. Justice was coming, but some victories leave scars that never fully heal. The arrest came at 6:47 a.m. on Friday morning, just as Victoria Blackwell was stepping out to retrieve her newspaper. Marcus watched from his kitchen window as 2 police cruisers pulled up to her pristine colonial home 3 streets over. Detective Chen emerged from the lead vehicle, warrant in hand, while a small crowd of neighbors gathered at a respectful distance. Victoria's carefully constructed world began crumbling the moment the handcuffs clicked shut. The charges were more severe than even Marcus had anticipated. Criminal mischief in the first degree, environmental destruction, unlawful interference with public utilities, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The fraud charge stemmed from her attempts to use HOA funds to pay for the specialized equipment needed to open the drainage valve. By noon, Rebecca Martinez's article had gone viral. HOA president arrested for environmental terrorism was trending on social media, with the story being picked up by national news outlets. The photos of the devastated lake combined with audio recordings from the HOA meeting painted a picture of power corruption that resonated far beyond Sunset Meadows. Marcus's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Environmental lawyers were calling to offer their services for the inevitable civil lawsuit. Documentary filmmakers wanted to interview him. A producer from a true crime podcast reached out featuring the story. What had started as a simple fishing dispute had become a cautionary tale about unchecked authority and community governance gone wrong. But the most satisfying call came from the district attorney's office. Assistant DA Robert Chen, no relation to Detective Chen, explained that Victoria's case was being fast-tracked due to the severity of the environmental damage and the clear evidence of premeditation. The tools found in her garage matched the marks on the drainage valve, he told Marcus over the phone. We also have security camera footage from a neighbor's house showing her vehicle near the lake at 2:30 a.m. on the night in question. She clearly planned this operation carefully, which actually makes the charges more serious, not less. The investigation had uncovered a web of Victoria's authoritarian behavior that shocked even Marcus. Rebecca Martinez's follow-up articles revealed that Victoria had been secretly recording phone conversations with residents, building files on anyone who opposed her decisions, and using her position to retaliate against neighbors through bogus code violations and harassment campaigns. 3 days after the arrest, Tom Harrison called an emergency board meeting to address Victoria's resignation and the growing legal crisis facing the HOA. The community center was packed again, but this time the mood was somber rather than angry. The insurance company has informed us that our liability coverage may not extend to criminal acts committed by board members, Tom announced, his voice heavy with exhaustion. We're looking at potentially devastating financial exposure from environmental cleanup costs, wrongful death claims for the fish kill, and property damage lawsuits. Marcus stood up, surprising everyone in the room. I want to make something clear, he said, his voice carrying easily through the silent space. This was never about money for me. This was about a woman who thought she could destroy something beautiful just to prove her power over other people. He paused, looking around the room at faces he'd known for years. But I also want justice for what she did. Not just to me, not just to the lake, but to this entire community. She turned neighbors against each other, created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion, and ultimately committed serious crimes that we're all going to pay for. The silence stretched for a long moment before elderly Mrs. Patterson, who lived near the lake and had been feeding the ducks there for 15 years, stood up with tears in her eyes. "I want her to pay for every single fish she killed," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. That lake wasn't just Marcus's fishing spot. It was our community's heart, and she murdered it out of spite. The criminal trial is scheduled for January, but Victoria's legal troubles were just beginning. The State Environmental Protection Agency had opened its own investigation. The IRS was reviewing the HOA's financial records for evidence of misused funds, and 3 separate civil lawsuits had been filed on behalf of affected residents. Marcus received daily updates from his attorney about Victoria's deteriorating situation. Her husband had filed for divorce, citing the public humiliation and potential financial ruin. Her real estate license was suspended pending the outcome of the criminal case. She'd been forced to sell her house to pay for legal representation, and early plea negotiations had stalled when prosecutors refused to reduce the felony charges. As autumn turned to winter, Marcus stood on his deck each morning looking out at the slowly recovering lake bed. The county had finally approved the restoration plan, but it would be months before water returned and years before the ecosystem recovered. Still, for the first time since that devastating September morning, he felt something approaching peace. Victoria Blackwell's reign of terror was over, and soon she would face the full consequences of her actions in a court of law. The trial began on a cold January morning, nearly 5 months after Victoria had destroyed the lake. Marcus arrived at the courthouse to find a line of reporters and curious onlookers stretching around the block. The case had become a symbol of HOA abuse and environmental justice, drawing attention from advocacy groups across the country. Victoria looked nothing like the imperious woman who had once terrorized Sunset Meadows. Dressed in a simple gray suit, her hair pulled back severely, she appeared diminished and defeated as she sat beside her court-appointed attorney. Her husband's divorce had been finalized the previous month, taking half of their remaining assets. The house sale had barely covered her mounting legal fees. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Detective Chen testified about the evidence found at the scene, including the fresh tool marks on the drainage valve and the tire tracks matching Victoria's vehicle. Dr. Hoffman presented heartbreaking testimony about the ecological damage, showing photographs of the hundreds of dead fish and explaining how the sudden drainage had destroyed decades of natural habitat development. But it was the security camera footage that sealed Victoria's fate. The grainy black and white video clearly showed her SUV approaching the lake at 2:30 a.m., remaining there for 47 minutes, then departing just before dawn. Enhanced audio from a neighbor's doorbell camera even captured the sound of metal on metal as she forced open the drainage valve. Marcus took the stand on the 3rd day, his testimony emotional but controlled. He described 3 years of peaceful morning fishing, the joy of teaching neighborhood children to cast their lines, and the devastating moment when he discovered the environmental destruction Victoria had wrought. She didn't just drain a lake to kill the packed courtroom. She destroyed a piece of our community's soul. She killed hundreds of innocent creatures just to prove she had the power to hurt people who stood up to her. Victoria's defense was weak and unconvincing. Her attorney argued that she had acted in what she believed were the community's best interests, that the drainage was intended as a temporary measure to address safety concerns. But under cross-examination, Victoria's own words from the HOA meeting came back to haunt her. "I did what I had to do to protect this community's values." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, guilty on all counts. Judge Patricia Morales didn't mince words during sentencing 2 weeks later. "Mrs. Blackwell, your actions represented breathtaking abuse of power and a callous disregard for environmental protection laws. You destroyed a natural habitat that took decades to develop, killed hundreds of wild animals, and traumatized an entire community, all because you couldn't tolerate a neighbor's peaceful enjoyment of a shared resource." Victoria received 18 months in state prison, 3 years of probation, and was ordered to pay $87,000 in restitution for environmental cleanup and restoration costs. She was also permanently banned from serving on any homeowners association board and required to complete 200 hours of community service with environmental conservation groups. As the gavel fell, Marcus felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but the victory felt hollow. The lake was still gone, the fish were still dead, and a community had been torn apart by one woman's need for control. 6 months later, on a warm morning in early summer, Marcus stood on his deck holding his coffee mug, a replacement for the one that had shattered that terrible September morning. Below him, construction crews were putting finishing touches on the new lake restoration project. Water had begun flowing back into the basin 3 weeks earlier, and already he could see small fish darting through the shallows. The new HOA board, elected in a landslide vote that saw unprecedented community participation, had established strict oversight procedures and term limits to prevent future abuses. Rebecca Martinez had won a state journalism award for her coverage of the case, and her follow-up series on HOA reform had led to legislative changes requiring greater transparency and accountability. Victoria Blackwell was serving her sentence at a minimum security facility 2 counties away. According to news reports, she spent her days working in the prison's organic garden program, a small irony that wasn't lost on Marcus. As the first rays of sunlight touched the slowly refilling lake, Marcus saw a great blue heron land at the water's edge, testing the shallow depths with one careful step. Life was returning to their wounded ecosystem, just as peace was returning to Sunset Meadows. He finished his coffee and headed inside to get his fishing gear. Tomorrow, he decided, would be a perfect morning to cast his first line into the new lake, and this time he'd make sure to invite some of the neighborhood kids to join him. After all, some traditions were worth fighting for, and some victories, no matter how hard won, were worth celebrating.